empty praise I think that I deserve. Lord, I come to you and I confess nothing I desire compares. All is lost in the shadow of the cross. Everything will fade. Here I am, open hands, come fill my life again. You're all I need. All the pain and suffering, every tear and haunting memory. Through the storm you're calling out to me. Child, just lay it down and see. Child, just lay it down and see. That all is lost in the shadow of the cross. Everything will fade. Here I am, open hands, come fill my life again. You're all I need. You're everything. Through the waves you are able. Through the doubt and the fear you are there. Perfect love, awesome power, you are casting out all fear. You are all I need. Through the waves you are able. Through the doubt and the fear you are there. Perfect love, awesome power, you are casting out all fear. You are all I need. Even death has lost its sting. On my own, blind I may be. With your light I see. May I walk in your ways. Help me see the path you lay. I am yours, I am yours, I am yours. Abandoned self, Lord, here I am. Forever yours, I take this stand. I am yours, I am yours, I am yours. Open hands and open hearts. My life is yours, I'm set apart. I will follow, I will go. All my days are yours alone. Open hands and open hearts. My life is yours, I'm set apart. I will follow, I will go. All my days are yours
Welcome to Loving the World Online.
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 Welcome to Loving the World Online. We thought today we'd be gathering together in live worship, but lots of things change really fast. So we're glad that you're joining us online, and we'll keep doing this as long as it's appropriate and it's safe. We're going to begin our services like we begin every week with the Word of God. We're beginning with Isaiah chapter 40. It's the first long psalm that we filmed and presented. It happened at youth camp that year, and I'm thinking about that a lot because we'd be just finishing youth camp right now. A lot of people are missing out on lots of things, but we're not missing out on the presence of God because He's willing to come and to meet us right now.
I'm Jaime Cortez, Community Pastor, and at this time, we want to take 1 minute to pray together. So wherever you are, if it's in your living room, if it's in your car, we want to invite you to take 1 minute to pray out loud. We want to pray for our leaders, we want to pray for the church, and we want to pray for the sick during this time. So take 1 minute and pray.
"155 years and 2 days ago, June 19, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger led over 2,000 federal soldiers, the 13th Army Corps, through the streets of Galveston, Texas. They stopped at various locations in the town: the Osterman Building, the Customs House, the courthouse, and a church. In each place, they read a military proclamation asserting Union control of Texas. In particular, General Order Number 3. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. That event is now celebrated as Juneteenth, the oldest emancipation celebration in the world. The news of the Emancipation Proclamation had taken 2.5 years to travel to the slaves of Texas, and it still took months for all 250,000 of the slaves to hear the news. Many slave owners waited until after the fall harvest to tell the freed men, women, and children. Over the last few weeks, I've talked to a number of people who are just hearing about some of the terrible events in our history in which black men and women were subjected to pain, torture, and death at the hands of white people. Some people are just becoming aware of the Tulsa race riots and the Chicago race riots. It made me start to wonder about the history of race and slavery here in Athens. And it connected directly to the text of Scripture in John chapter 13. Last week I talked about Joshua's challenge to choose between becoming a slave to God in the servant chapter of the Old Testament. John chapter 13 is the servant chapter of the New Testament, and it presents the same choice using the same language in one of the most provocative acts of Jesus' ministry. When Jesus washed the disciples' feet, dressing and acting as the lowest of house slaves, he broke with hundreds of years of tradition. He broke with the philosophers and thinkers. This moment is unique in all of ancient literature. There's nothing like it anywhere. It should be more startling to us. If we understood it, it would take our breath away. Many people tried to use the Bible to prop up the institution of slavery in our country. They did it by ignoring this passage of Scripture. I believe that when Jesus washed the disciples' feet, he took a bold stance challenging the social dictates of his time and sketching out what a new society could look like. Jesus set himself up as what an ideal person looks like. He challenges us to work against the cultural norms of our day. Weaving into the story of Jesus becoming a slave, I want to tell you some of the slave stories of Athens. We need to know these stories too, because we're living in a day of reckoning in which we need to look at our own history and confront it and work to heal it. As I read and studied this passage, I came up with 5 questions we should all be asking right now.
It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end.
The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus.
Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist.
After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him.
He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?"
Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand."
"No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet."
Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you will have no part with me."
"Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well."
Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath only need to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you is." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean.
When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am."
Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash another's feet.
I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you.
I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them.
This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Is it time? In chapter 13, verse 1, John makes an assertion. The time has come. When we're reading it, it doesn't seem like a startling sentence, but in the context of the book of John, it's a remarkable moment. Time forms the structure of the book to this point. On multiple occasions, John has pointed out that it was not yet time for Jesus. When the triumphal entry of chapter 12 happens, the time has come. The other major structure of the book is religious festivals. In chapter 13, verse 1, the festival of the Passover and time connect. This is the most important time for the history of the world. Is it time? It's an important question in life. I was reading in my father's notes in his Bible and came to a passage where he was struggling and asking whether or not to intervene in his children's lives. He believed that children should be allowed to make mistakes, to be responsible, to suffer consequences. He frequently decided it was not time for him to do anything but wait and watch. It was his parenting style. Sometimes I was so frustrated that he would not give me an answer, he would not help out when I was struggling. There were other times when he came wading in for help, when he felt it was time. Our culture is littered with the moments when churches could have stepped in to help, but abandoned people in their time of need. Today is Father's Day, and one of the great questions for all fathers is a question of timing. What should I do today to lead my family, that they might find Christ, that they might follow Him? I met lots of people who decided that what they should do is put off that leadership to some other time. A time when they're not too busy, when work is not so hard, when they're not pulled by so many other interests. We have a tendency to delay, to wait, when it is time to act. I'm standing just north of Robbins Road near the Family Dollar store. This is the location of the Fisher Robinson Cemetery. Tragically, you can walk this ground and find no evidence of the cemetery. Through fraud and desecration, this black cemetery has been erased from history. Over the last 40 years, groups have been trying to reclaim the cemetery, and they've been frustrated. The last effort 2 years ago, they came and cleared the land, but the historical marker has yet to be acquired. It's now a beautiful little meadow in the middle of our town filled with birds. In 1874, a Methodist church and black cemetery were founded on this property by Dilsey Ruffin, a former slave in Henderson County, who bought the property and created the cemetery. In the 1880 census, we find her listed as a housekeeper. In the late 1930s, a land speculator, Bob Bass, forged documents and claimed the land. He started to run cattle on it, and then the marker stones were dug up and hauled off. The graves remained under the ground, and years of litigation have kept the truth in the dark. It's like lots of the stories of the mistreatments of black men and women. We just cover them over. But it's time. It's time. It's time to recognize this history of Athens. Over the west staircase of the Senate wing of the U.S. Capitol hangs an iconic image of American history entitled First Reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was painted in 1864. It portrays Lincoln and his cabinet. The painter spent 6 months in the White House recording his experiences, watching the president, and then painting this picture. It gained new prominence when it appeared on the cover of the best-selling book, Team of Rivals. In the bottom right-hand corner of the page is a map. First published in 1861, it used information from the 1860 census describing the population density of slavery in America. Lincoln used it all through the war. Zoom in to Henderson County. 23% of the people were enslaved, 1,116 people. Between 1860 and 1865, more slaves poured into our county as slave owners tried to flee the approaching Union Army. At least 150,000 people were forced to march to Texas. Today, I want you to meet Maddie Gilmore. She was one of those slaves who was forcibly moved from Alabama to Texas and ended up in bondage and fear here in Athens. Her story is told in the Federal Slave Narrative Project, undertaken between 1936 and 1938, part of the Works Project Administration. Former slaves were interviewed, and then those notes were transcribed. At the end of Maddie Gilmore's life, when she was in her 90s, she was alone. Her children born into slavery were dead. The father of her children, an unrecognized husband, was dead. She was disabled and unable to pay her bills. When she arrived in Athens, she came with her older sister, Rachel, her last living relative. And then Rachel was put on the auction block here in Athens. They stripped her naked while men bid to buy her. Dick Burden of Kaufman paid $1,000 for her. Maddie said, "I cried till I just couldn't cry, but it didn't do any good." After freedom came to her, Maddie went and found Rachel in Kaufman and brought her back to Athens. She was broken by overwork, and though doctors assisted, she died not long after coming back to Athens. This is what it looks like to be a slave. And this is what Jesus needs us to see when he takes on the role of a slave.
Good morning, church. My name is Wade Huggins. I'm the worship pastor here at First Baptist Athens. You know, we're all creatures of habit, and sometimes those habits get changed. And in this season of COVID-19, things have definitely changed. I was thinking about that whole thing of not singing at church in this season that we're in, and I was brought to the song Heart of Worship by Matt Redman. In the 1990s, when he wrote this song, his pastor came to him and said, "Matt, I really think our church has lost its heart for worship, and we need to change something." So what they decided to do was actually take all the instruments away, take all the lights away, take all the microphones away, and they just simply came and sang a cappella in their church to God. After a season, Matt said, "Before long, we reintroduced the musicians and the sound system as we had gained a new perspective that worship is all about Jesus. And he commands a response in the depths of our souls, no matter the circumstance or the setting. The heart of worship simply describes what occurred. So here we are, in a different circumstance, in a different setting, but our heart for worship can come to the Father in reverence and awe. And that's what he wants from you today. Jesus says in John 4:23, "Yet a time is coming and has now come when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks." He wants your heart today. Nothing more, nothing less. So let's bring him our heart as we worship him this morning.
When the music fades and all is stripped away, and I simply come, longing just to bring something that's a word that will bless your heart. I'll bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within, through the way things appear. You're looking into my heart. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the thing I've made it, when it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. King of endless worth, no one could express how much you deserve. Though I'm weak and poor, all I have is yours. Every single breath, yes. I'll bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within, through the way things appear. You're looking into my heart.
Is it my place? In chapter 13, verse 1, John uses another word that's pivotal to his book, world. It's the same word from his famous verse in chapter 3, verse 16, for God so loved the world. We live in a space, our world. Social distancing has not been so hard in East Texas because many people came here for a good letting alone. We tend to give each other space and try to mind our own business. But something is going on in our culture right now. We're being called to make the fate of our brothers and sisters our business. Not in the vulgar Karen sense, but to face up to the reality of the systemic racism of our society and commit to creating a better place to live. On this Father's Day, we have to recognize that there are moments when we ask people to step up and sacrifice themselves and involve themselves. We can't just look away, we can't just ignore. We have to choose to own our place in this world. Maddie Gilmore tells painful stories. She tells about the relentless work. She describes the overseers forcing them to work from before sunrise until sunset every day. In one part, she describes young nursing mothers forced into the fields and their newborns left under the trees while the moms continued to work. Once, while they were all working, an animal came and took one of the babies away. Maddie said the poor mama cried until she couldn't cry, but it didn't do any good. Whose place was it to do something, to say something, to step in and to intervene? Whose place was it to sacrifice? Jesus says that we are given this place. He put us here. We are His representatives, and it is our responsibility to fill this place with His presence. In John 13, Jesus chooses the slaves in the field. He says, "That's my place." Welcome to our Yellow Chair interview. This morning I'm interviewing Jessica Richardson about one of her Facebook posts. So we're excited that you're here, Jessica.
Thanks. A lot of people probably just press fast forward.
Yeah, they're a little worried. They're a little worried about what's getting ready to happen. So Jessica, why don't you introduce yourself to us?
I'm Jessica Richardson. First Baptist Athens is my home church. I grew up here for 18 years. I'm born into this congregation, which I love dearly. And now I'm living in Tyler. I work with Next Step Community Solutions. We're the leading provider of mental health services in schools in East Texas.
How many schools do y'all do?
We're in 26 school districts
Yeah.
and 18 juvenile probation offices.
Wow. So that's a big reach, and you help fundraise for them?
Yes,
Yeah,
fundraise
that's really cool.
and communication.
Well, so I really do want to talk to you about Facebook posts that happened a couple of days ago. So you were talking to a neighbor and something happened. So tell us that story.
Yes, so I have a neighbor who just moved bought the lot adjacent to mine in Tyler. And he is from Dallas, doesn't know Tyler or Smith County very well at all. And we were in a conversation just about the area, and he asked if I had ever read my deed restrictions for the property, and I had not. When you buy a piece of property, you sign hundreds of documents.
Right.
And so the historical deed had gotten lost in the shuffle. But he said there was some real alarming language that surprised him.
Right.
So I went and I pulled it, and I did have it in my filing cabinet. And I got to the last page, or the second page of 2 pages, and there in black and white was a restriction on the property that said that the property could not be sold or occupied by anyone of African blood or descent unless they were servants at the property.
Wow. When was this deed restriction put in there? Kind of give us the date.
So it was signed September 5th, 1959.
Wow. And how does that align with kind of the laws of the government and kind of what was going on?
So in my research in the past week, I discovered there are two Supreme Court cases that really affect these types of covenant restrictions. And the first was in 1948, and it was a case out of St. Louis, and it declared racially restrictive deeds unconstitutional.
Okay.
But they weren't actually outlawed and declared unenforceable until the Fair Housing Act of 1968.
Wow. So this was filed after that Supreme Court case, before it was, so it existed in that kind of middle structure. And it just stays on your deed? It doesn't ever go away? I mean, what's up with that?
Right, so a historical deed for a property is always going to be in print, from what I understand. At the county level, it will always exist in a file in the Smith County Courthouse. But there have been a lot of cases where homeowners, in the last 30 years or so, have moved to strike these from the deed that follows them when they sell the property.
Right.
And they do that through their HOA, or they petition the city, their municipality to help get that removed.
So there's a way to get it off of the current one, but it's always, the stains kind of always kind of be down there.
Right.
So now, we were talking about this earlier in the week, and what I was surprised was there's kind of two different ways people are thinking about this. So kind of take me to those two different ideas.
Well, so once I discovered this, and the post spread really quickly, and I was asked immediately what I'm going to do about it. And I wanted to be really sensitive to the community that this directly affected.
Right.
And I think it's really easy for white Americans like myself who have enjoyed the unearned privilege of never being victimized by overt racism to decide how to handle a situation like that.
Yeah.
And so I really wanted to listen.
Mm-hmm.
I contacted the NAACP in Tyler, and they directed me to the state level.
Mm-hmm.
And because in cases where this has changed, it's been the NAACP that stepped in. It's very expensive the process is expensive. And so they've come along as an advocacy arm to make that happen. So I wanted to hear, and they've taken two different stances. So the first stance is that they've left it in place in places like Seattle, to remind people of this, what
legacy, kind of what's there.
A hurtful reminder of what existed at a time that affected generations of families.
Right.
And then in other cases, they've acted to strike it from the deed, keep it on record at the county level, but strike it from the deed so that it doesn't give any property owner. There are cases where they've still been influenced to keep certain people out of neighborhoods, even though it's unlawful.
Right.
It's still they've still quoted it when they've found a buyer that didn't fit that description.
Wow.
So even though it's not lawful and it's unenforceable from a legal standpoint, in the minds of people, they've latched onto it when they've wanted to and have been able to use it. So in talking with my local chapter of the NAACP, they really want to have it removed for that reason.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like sometimes we want to remove it because we want to ignore that. We just want to move on, right?
Right.
And that sometimes is our tendency. Like, let's not own that. Let's not think about that. That was a long time ago. That's not us, right? But those stains, they call it redlining in communities. It was interesting after you and I learned about this, I called a realtor in our town, and he said that these deed restrictions are in property here in Athens. He said, like in Bel Air, sometimes it's there. Mm-hmm. And so when I heard about it, I was like, oh, I kind of hope that there's a conversation with lots of people to say what are the legacies that are holding on, and what should we do about them? We should be having these same conversations. I
agree. On my way to Athens for this interview, I got a call from a friend of mine telling me, do not read the posts from the media posts that
Because
do not read the
you're on
comments.
television, the TV station.
Yes, so
interviewed you.
KLTV and CBS 19
Right.
did a story yesterday that aired last night, and the comments from the community on those posts have been really, there's a lot of anger for even addressing the issue.
Yeah.
That it's, it's not something we need to talk about. But in listening to communities of color, they want to talk about it.
Yeah.
They want to talk about it a lot. And I feel like we're at a time in our country where we're all having to grapple with these feelings of, what is racism?
Yeah.
And where does racism exist? And one of the first things that struck me when I found this deed restriction is that it drove home to me that you can feel like you're a good person who is actively anti-racist and still exist in a racist system that is institutional and in our own homes.
Yeah.
And that's something I think we have to talk about.
I think so too. Thanks for coming and talking to us and sharing your story. And we love you and are proud of you. Keep doing good work.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Do they know I love them? In John chapter 13, verse 1, John describes the love that Jesus has for the world. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The question Jesus' people should be asking is, do people know that I love them? Jesus' ministry is characterized by a profound love of people that did not look like him, that did not act like him, that did not deserve his love. For 3 years, he's been showing them love, but then it says he wanted to do something so unique, so deep and profound that John says it was at this moment that they saw the full extent of his love. They did not see it first on the cross, but at their feet in the face of a man who became a slave to love them. Our world functions on a pattern of power and fear. Powerful people often keep their power by keeping people in fear. That's what happened in Athens after the Civil War. The KKK showed up to terrorize. Maddie talks about it in her interview. Jesus showed us a different way to live. He does not use his power to instill fear, but emptied himself of power and becomes like a slave. Maddie Gilmore tells the story of her uncle. He was accused of a crime. There was no investigation, no police were called, no evidence was offered, just the mob. The mob came and beat him and beat him and beat him. And then they made the enslaved men and women gather around a wagon. And they stood her uncle up in the back of it and put a rope around his neck and asked him if there was anything that he wanted to say. He asked if he could see his wife. She came to the wagon with their baby, and he told her to be good and to raise the baby right. And he kissed the child and then his wife. And then he told the crowd that he was innocent, that he had not done what they had said. And then he prayed. And then they drove their wagon away. After an hour, they cut him down and buried him. Jesus made us agents of his love. But when those in power act outside of justice, act in power and fear, they deny the love of Jesus. Jesus' followers should be asking, have I sacrificially shown love to the people around me, not just to the people that I love, not just to my family, but to all the people around me?
Wonderful, merciful Savior, precious Redeemer and friend, who would have thought
Am I serving or being served? In chapter 13, verse 16, Jesus uses the word doulos. In the NIV, it's translated as servant. It's a bad translation. In fact, in the last 10 years, many translations have rendered it in the more accurate way, slave. I take the truth, no slave is greater than his master. We don't like the sound of that. We don't want it to be the word slave. And so we soften it by using the word servant. But by softening it, we rob Jesus of the dramatic, prophetic action that he takes in showing us the full extent of his love. When Jesus takes off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist and washed his disciples' feet, he shatters the social fabric of his day. The task of washing feet was so abhorrent to the Jews that a Jewish slave could never be asked to do it because it was considered too demeaning. Social structure and boundaries were protected at all costs. Slaves must stay slaves. They were property. They were not given funerals when they died. When Jesus crossed that boundary, he ushered in a new world. Over time, people have been disappointed with Jesus, disappointed that he didn't end slavery during his ministry, disappointed that he didn't lead a slave rebellion, disappointed that the church taught slaves how to live and how to survive in the world they were in. People have asked, where was Jesus and the question of slavery? In John chapter 13, we get a clear answer. Jesus was on the side of the slaves. It was his clearest example of love. He aligned himself with the marginalized and the voiceless. I've grown up around the defenders of the culture of the South, but it's time to come clean. Slavery was a massive evil, and no one in the South that propped it up, and none of the people that profited from it have clean hands. The people of the South knew better. They had other choices. Slavery was convenient, profitable, and inhumane. Racism has followed in its path. The problem was not the morality, but the greed. The taxable value of property in Henderson County, according to the 1860 census, was $2,114,874. Of that, $1,464,179 was personal property, slaves. Almost all of the value of the county was enslaved people. The largest slave owner in Henderson County was Nate Coleman. He owned 50 slaves. Just north of Athens, on 175, about 6 miles from the town square, is a historical marker. It is dedicated to William Richardson. He's important to our church because he is one of our founding organizers. He came from Alabama in 1855, and when he came, he brought his slaves. He and his brother helped found our church. The slaves he brought to Texas were Dinah, Charles, Jen, Rachel, Washington, Henry, Tom, Harrison, Kate, Easter, Till, Carolina, Jane, Sam, Congo, Marion, Mim, and Jube. They were not ignorant of the truth. They just decided that their selfish desires outweighed the humanity of the people they enslaved. Maddie Gilmore was a slave at the time William Richardson was helping to establish Athens and our church. She described the beatings that were inflicted on the slaves. She said it only happened to her once. Thomas Barrow's middle daughter, near to her own age, Jane, told Maddie something that she was to do. Maddie spoke back to Jane. Jane began to beat Maddie, and Maddie resisted. The proverbial wisdom was not to resist, to just do what the master said. But Maddie defended herself. It's hard to take abuse over and over again and not resist. The master, Thomas Barrow, arrived. They took Maddie in front of all the other slaves, and they stripped off all of her clothes, and they made her stand naked before them all. And then they lay her on her belly, and they beat her with a strap filled with holes. When she got up, she said, "I was glad to do what Miss Jane said for me to do." Jesus takes on the role of a slave. He accepts the whip like a slave. He goes to the cross, the most shameful way to die. And Jesus asks us to follow him. I've been told by too many Christians that they were not there during slavery, that they have no responsibility to heal those wounds. But those of us who have profited from the economy that drained money from enslaved black people and oppressed black people do owe the debt of love to them in partial payment for what was extracted from them. We are called to serve them.
At this time, we're going to say the Lord's Prayer together out loud as a church family. I invite you to join with me as we pray the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
What should a great person do? Jesus returns to the table. Do you understand, he asks. Jesus is trying to teach us something profound and deep and internal, not temporary, thin, and external. He's not talking about how to get our feet clean, but how to get our lives cleaned from sin and the bondage of sin, and how to live in a world where we see people differently. In John chapter 3, verse 17, he says, "Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." It's my argument over and over again that the central mission of the people of God was given to Abraham in chapter 12, verse 3 of Genesis. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. We are given the task of blessing all the people of the world. I do not think it's an accident that Jesus harkens back to that word in this moment. He only uses it one other place in the Gospel of John. If we want to bless the world, then we need to become the slaves of love. On this Father's Day, I want to ask you dads, are you leading your family by the example of Jesus? Are you sacrificially serving them? Do they know your love? Jesus says, this slavery to love is measured by actions, not thoughts or intentions. Jesus says you will be blessed if you do them. In the last few weeks, I've heard so many people express disdain for protesters and looters, for criminals and policemen, for Republicans and Democrats. It seems like everyone is searching for people to dislike and to blame for the state of the world. All the time forgetting that Jesus washed Judas's feet. Jesus fully loved Judas. He was not looking for a way to distance himself from Judas, but offered him the full extent of his love. Please, I beg you, before you post another thing on Facebook, ask yourself, does this look like washing their feet or splashing mud on them? Maddie Gilmore tells us that her master's name was Thomas Barrow. She cannot tell you how many slaves Thomas Barrow had because there were several wagon loads full of them. She describes Thomas Barrow's family, their wealth, their nice clothes, their nice house. She describes their forced march through the nights as they fled from the Union soldiers. She describes the beatings. She describes seeing the Barrow family celebrating Christmas morning while the slaves toiled without rest. She tells us that Thomas Barrow was a Methodist preacher. Maddie describes him instructing them from the Bible and praying with them. She tells us that they were not allowed to baptize, nor allowed to have weddings. The question that always comes to me is, What kind of man would I have been in 1861? Would I have been like Thomas Barrow? Or would I have stood up to the system that was around me and tried to change it? And isn't that the same question that we should be asking right now? What kind of man am I today? Am I willing to allow society to keep going the way that it's going? Am I willing to let the systemic racism that is inherent in our system to go unchanged or unchallenged? Like this cemetery. Should I just look away and let the trees grow back up? I know some of you don't believe that all of this is true, but I'd like to sit with you and talk with you and convince you that when we all stand before God, He's not going to ask us about what our forefathers did, but what we did, knowing what we know. I pray when you leave today, you might go and read the story of Maddie Gilmore, so you can have more of a personal understanding of the enslaved people who lived right here in Athens. I urge you to look at Jesus' actions to become a slave to love and make it your goal. If you are in a group, I want you to ask those 5 questions and talk about them together. Is it time? Is it my place? Do they know that I love them? Am I serving or being served? What would a great person do? I'm so glad that you joined us for worship today. Make sure you go to the Next Steps link on the webpage. Go to my research notes. You can read Maddie's story there. You can find out more information about a lot of things I mentioned about the cemetery on Robbins Road that's needing repair and recovery. You can go there and find family activities and links to giving. Please stay engaged in our church. Why don't you invite someone to watch this service by sending them a link to it? We're finding that lots of people are joining us. It's a great way to reach out to other people right now. Now, wherever you are, why don't you stand up and let's say our motto together.
Love God, live like Jesus, serve others.
Let's go.